In this video, I want to present a new tool that we developed called PREDICTOR. It helps in predicting likely distributions of takeover response times in semi-automated vehicles. There's a lot more detail in the paper, but here I want to mostly demonstrate this tool itself. But just to go over a little bit of the detail. The starting point is that in semi-automated vehicles, they perform the driving task or part of the driving task, but occasionally they need human assistance. They might issue an alert and the human might need to respond. And there might be a transition of who controls the vehicle. And if the human takes over, that might be a takeover response. And for these transitions of control or takeover responses, the typical perspective is that there's an alert and you need to respond as fast as possible. And typically the speed is measured in studies of how fast you respond, but sometimes also accuracy. However, a maybe not so obvious assumption behind this seems to be that people are sitting ready to grab the wheel, but that might not always be how attention works, particularly if these vehicles do better. There have been observations that humans do other stuff. They might, for example, be distracted by their phone. So instead of this engineering perspective, we've proposed in the past already that you can also look at it from an interruption perspective. There's a lot of theory on how people handle interruptions, such as a phone call when they're in their office or an incoming email alert. And we've applied that to automated driving. So the idea is that maybe you're doing something else, you're having a conversation with a passenger, or maybe you're doing something on your phone while the car is driving. And ideally in a case, of course, where the car is allowed to do the drive and you are allowed to do some other task. Then an alert might go off and you, before you respond, you might perhaps go back and forth. There might be some time to look at the road or see whether you can finish that last sentence that you were typing before grabbing hold of the wheel eventually. And then you might drive, and after a while you might return the control to the car and start orienting to your original task again. In this process, you can actually identify a lot of detailed steps beyond the onset of the alert and the onset of when you grab the wheel. And we've defined actually 10 stages that you could look at in your study. That's written up somewhere else in this paper. And the benefit of identifying those targeted stages is not to say that it's good or that that's what people should do. However, it does allow us to do targeted tests and interventions in scenarios where I do think that some people might be distracted. But what do we actually know in practice? What does the data say? And there's a lot less data on many of these steps. So a lot of studies, because they say how fast do you respond to the alert, there's the interval between stage 1 and 5, as we call it, that's available. But these other stages in between, what's happening there? There's a lot less data. This is where PREDICTOR comes in. We recently published it. This is the paper, but you can also check out the tool online. In essence, PREDICTOR helps you simulate what response time distributions of 4 stages might look like after an alert. This is very briefly what PREDICTOR is like. So you set some input, what do you want to see, and then the interface gives you output, some distribution and some data. Under the hood there's a database that feeds into the input, so a set of studies with details on takeover times. Based on your input, the model computes what distributions might look like and then simulates them, which it generates as output. So with that, I think it is time for a demo. You can also try the tool yourself. This is the link. I'll post it also in the video description below. So here is the tool. You can see the website here. I can select here what parameters I want to see, and then here I have all kinds of outputs. So for example, I might select what alert onset studies I might want to consider, but for now let's look at alert modality. So let's look at visual auditory alerts only. I leave the non-driving related task modality and input and output, I'll leave that as is, but you can, for example, look at whether people were doing an auditory task or a visual task, and whether their output was just thinking or a manual output or some type of mix. I'm going to rename this as visual auditory. And here's some advanced settings that I won't change. So now what you see here is time as it unfolds in milliseconds. I can adjust the x-axis if I want to, but I won't do that. And how frequently the simulation thinks certain times might occur. For each of the different stages, they have a different color. And behind it is how many study groups the data is based on. So the blue stage, there's 12 experiments or 12 experimental groups that provided data to this. Stage 5, so this is the physical response. There's a lot of data leading to it, as these are most reported in the literature. You can also go to a different tab, compare simulations, for example. If I have just one model, I can see in more detail what these predicted distributions might look like for different stages. So from the alert onset to disengagement of my non-driving related task, or from alert onset to orientating to the driving road, or from alert onset to eventual suspension of the non-driving task, or from alert onset to the physical transfer of control. Let's now look at the success rate of transitions. So as time unfolds, what proportion of simulations or fraction, so 100% or 0%, has completed a specific stage. So stage 2 is completed first, then stage 3, stage 4, stage 5. But as these stages come later, they are completed later. We can set where is a critical event. For example, 6.5 seconds. But let's set it back to 10. Then if you scroll down here, we can see what proportion of the stages was reached. So 100 at what time? 100% of stage 2 was reached after 1889 milliseconds, but already 95% was reached after 776 milliseconds. Where it's stage 5, that long tail, that last bit, that's the difference between 11 seconds and 23 seconds. There's a lot of caveats here, so check the paper for details. We can also say, well, by what point was a stage reached, but how far away are we from the critical event? So 0 is at the time of the critical event, but what if we want to know what percentage of stages was already completed 4 seconds before the critical event? So if the deadline is at 10 seconds, this would be at 6 seconds. So stage 2 is completed, stage 3 the majority, stage 5 fewer. As you get closer to the deadline, or as more time is reached, more is done, and more is completed, and you can set the deadline differently to see different impacts. So if we say 4.5 seconds, then 4 seconds before it, which would be half a second after alert onset, stage 5 is not completed, right? So this changes with this value. Let's set this back to 10. There's also a summary table where we can see what the values are. So instead of looking at the visuals, you can get the minimum response time and the max response time, the mean, median, standard deviations, and also how many groups were considered and of how many papers they come. And there's a table where you can look, well, what's the included data? Now, one nice thing is you can also compare simulations. So now we had visual auditory, but what if we compare it with just visual, for example? So here, visual, let's call this visual. And what if we only have auditory? Let's call it auditory. If we now do compare simulations, we can see the 3 simulations. And what's interesting, you can already see here, some are grayed out, they're 0 because there's just no studies known that just report that report data of this stage disengagement with just a visual alert. Now you can look at what the distributions look at. For example, that bimodal alerts tend to be a bit more on the left, although you typically see that with the early stages and not necessarily with later stages. There's more overlap between the distributions. So we just described that in the paper in a bit more detail. It's always important to look at how many studies were even considered for these simulations. If you only have 3 studies, it's perhaps less reliable compared to when you have 42 studies. Okay, that's the demo. So why might you want to use Predictor? Well, it's simulations, so it gives you a sense of what time distributions might look like, not what they actually look like, but what they might look like. And we need more data to really test all those predictions. It also allows you to compare these distributions for different types of data. So for example, for audio alerts versus bimodal alerts. It also allows you to integrate new data with the existing data set in an interactive manner. And you can read the details about that in the paper. So check the paper for lots more details on the motivation and on the limitations of the tool, but also on how it works. We also give an initial demonstration of what we think some of the interesting patterns are that we saw based on Predictor. You can find links to the code. The code is online, but you can also download it for your own machine. And you can find even more details on the tool in the appendix. So again, you can check out the tool yourself. Here's the link. And here is the reference to the paper if you want to read more and check out the tool. I hope it's useful for you.